It's time now for us to look at exactly what we'll be doing. In the presentation today, it's important for me to help you understand the relationships between hand hygiene, behind environmental surfaces and glove use, and how those three relationships work together in either transmission or prevention of transmission of healthcare associated infections, or HAIs. I'd like to spend some time together describing and talking about how best practice recommendations can be applied in regard to specific settings or generally, and in regard to specific procedures or organism-specific hand hygiene requirements. We'll also be talking a little bit about best practice recommendations regarding glove use, and those again will be in general settings and or procedure-specific settings. We know that skin integrity is an important part of hand hygiene and glove use, so I will try and share with you at least 10 ways in which we can protect skin integrity but at the same time comply with hand hygiene and glove use recommendations. And then we'll finish today's presentation by discussing some recommended actions that can be taken in the event of either you or someone that you're working with experiencing a skin investigation. And what are those steps in investigating and managing that irritation? So let's start now by looking at the relationships between hand hygiene, environmental surfaces and glove use. We've known a lot about hands and hand hygiene for several hundred years in fact, but we really are only now starting to understand the importance of environmental surfaces. So we know that healthcare associated infections, or HAIs, are those infections that are acquired by healthcare consumers during any treatment that they have for any other condition. We know that HAIs can occur in any healthcare setting. So whilst much of what's reported in the scientific literature and many of the reports that we can read from Australian and international bodies are associated with infections in hospitals, we do know that they can occur in primary care settings, in podiatry settings, in physiotherapy settings, in laboratories, in ambulances even. There's opportunities for transmission in all of those primary care settings and those settings where healthcare is delivered outside of the hospital. Most of the data that we report comes from the acute care setting, so I apologise for that, but we can work around it. We know that around the world that probably between 5 to 10% of all patients admitted to an acute care hospital will develop an infection associated with that admission. Now fortunately, most of those infections are relatively minor, but many of them can be serious, and in some cases they can be life-threatening, or they can take a person's life. So not only are these infections serious, they're also very expensive. And in some countries we understand them far better than in others. And in developed countries such as the United States, they've spent many decades reviewing and trying to understand these infections. And what they know now is that every year in the US they have about 2 million healthcare associated infections, and those 2 million infections contribute to up to 90,000 deaths of American consumers of healthcare every year. That costs the American healthcare system about $4.5 billion, or so it was estimated in 1998. So with increasing healthcare costs in that last decade and a half, then we'd expect that cost to be substantially higher. England is not much different to the United States proportionally per population, and the cost there has been estimated to be about £1 billion every year. In Australia we don't have accurate data on every case of healthcare associated infection, but certainly in the last few years, and increasingly so, we are better able to understand the true incidence and the number of deaths, disabilities, and some of the costs that are associated with about 200,000 healthcare associated infections that occur in our country each year. We know that those 200,000 healthcare associated infections contribute to probably about 7,000 deaths. Now what's interesting is in all of these statistics, these cost estimates likely exclude any outbreaks of emerging infectious diseases. So this is just our baseline burden every year. Throw into that mix something like SARS or even avian influenza or outbreaks of emerging multiple resistant organisms, and the costs and the numbers become much higher. So it's a serious problem from a microbiological level, from a financial level, from a political level. And we want healthcare consumers to have confidence in the system and to come and to seek healthcare as appropriately and as early as they need to. So understanding the burden and the impact of these infections, I think, helps us appreciate how important preventing them can be. And in some cases, prevention is not that difficult. For example, we know that hand hygiene, for more than 200 years, as I've already said, is a major way. It's the single most effective way that we can prevent transmission of healthcare-associated infections. Knowing that, we would expect that most healthcare workers, the vast majority in fact, would be competent and consistently perform hand hygiene. However, in the last 5 or so years, when we've studied this issue deeply across both the public and private sectors in Australia, we've found disappointing results. After several years of investment, the most recent Period 2 data from 2013 tells us that of almost 700 contributing hospitals across Australia, hand hygiene compliance sits at around 78%, meaning that more than 1/5 of the time healthcare workers are either not performing hand hygiene or not performing hand hygiene appropriately. Now these numbers are large. They're based on a large sample of moments or opportunities for hand hygiene. So we can be quite confident that that figure is quite close to the truth. The World Health Organization very eloquently defined 5 moments of hand hygiene. They are the 5 moments, and they are before touching a patient, before performing a procedure, after a procedure or body fluid exposure risk, after touching a patient, or after touching a patient's surroundings. Now what's interesting in all of this is that the two moments with the highest levels of compliance are after a procedure or body fluid exposure, where the mean compliance in this most recent rating period was 86.2%, or after touching a patient, moment 4, where the most recent reported figure was 84%. They are the highest levels of compliance across the moments, which suggests that healthcare workers actually care more about protecting themselves than they do protecting their patients in terms of hand hygiene activity. Because the other 2 moments, which are before touching a patient or before performing a procedure, are compliances as low as 74% or just around 80%. So there's lots of work that still needs to be done. We can continue to understand this. Whether we will actually ever get increased compliance close to 100% seems highly unlikely, given the large amount of resources and activity and commitment that's been undertaken in Australia. So given that scenario, we need to be responsible, and we need to think about, well, if we aren't going to get 100% hand hygiene, what do we need to do to change our healthcare workers' behaviour, or what added protections can we put in place? And maybe understanding the presence of organisms is one way that we can address this. And if you look at this slide again from some of the experts at the World Health Organization, they used a very simple graphic. And here in the areas that are marked red, we can see that organisms are always present on the patient's skin and on the immediate surroundings of the patient. The patient's constantly shedding organisms. So the bedridden patient particularly will be colonised around their nose, their perineum, and perhaps their inguinal areas and their upper extremities, sheds these organisms out into the environment. And those environments that are close, usually within about a metre of the patient, become very efficient reservoirs for organisms shed. Now when does this become a problem? It becomes a problem in lots of times. Think about what would happen if someone comes and has direct contact with the patient, as we saw in those earlier moments, or direct contact with the patient's environment, and then subsequently they don't perform hand hygiene? Well, I'll show you graphically what that can look like. In this slide, we see the healthcare worker doing something very simple, taking the patient's pulse, or inspecting perhaps their IV cannula site. Immediately, there can be transmission or transfer of organisms from the patient to the healthcare worker. Or in fact, if the healthcare worker has organisms on their hands from a previous patient that they've touched and the healthcare worker hasn't performed hand hygiene, then they could cross-transfer those organisms to the patient. So this is as simple as that transfer or transmission can be. So always it shows us that hand hygiene is important before contact with the patient, as we've talked about in the 5 moments, and definitely after contact with the patient. So let's now spend some time looking at the environment and the role of the environment in transmission. Again, this is not graphical, but it's a model. And we've always treated our environmental surfaces as non-critical. So we know they don't need to be sterile. We know they don't always need to be disinfected. They're not entering a sterile part of the patient's body. But what we do know is that those environmental surfaces do often come in contact with healthcare workers' hands. And that when that contact occurs, there can be a two-way exchange of microorganisms. So the healthcare worker comes along and has contact with an inanimate surface. Organisms from that inanimate surface can contaminate the hands of the healthcare worker, who then touches a patient, only performs hand hygiene between 50 to 78% of the time, and can easily transfer that infection on. Or the patient may contaminate the inanimate surface, or may pick up transfer of organisms from that contaminated inanimate surface. So this is a real issue. It demonstrates to us the importance of using barriers, such as gloves, for some certain procedure-specific activities that we perform in healthcare. It demonstrates to us the importance of having clean environmental areas, and sometimes that requires disinfection, and it also demonstrates the importance of hand hygiene to us. So just so that you'll understand again and be refreshed on the World Health Organisation's recommended 5 moments of healthcare, which have been also recommended by Healthcare Australia, Hand Hygiene Australia rather. These are the 5 moments for hand hygiene before any patient contact, before performing a procedure on the patient, after doing a procedure on the patient or having any contact with body fluid exposure risks such as emptying a catheter bag or some other body fluid exposure, and then always after patient contact or after contact with the patient's surroundings. So I think you understand and you literally do get the picture of hand hygiene and the environment and its relationship in potential to spread healthcare-associated infections. We'll move now and start looking at the best practice recommendations in regard to hand hygiene generally, for specific settings and for specific procedures or with specific organisms. And each of those things can make a very subtle difference. So we know that hand hygiene is the single most important thing. I've told you that already once today. We also don't know, however, the specific number or the specific types of healthcare-associated infections that are prevented specifically by changing our hand hygiene practices. So if we don't perform hand hygiene, we're not sure which infections are more likely to occur. Conversely, if we perform hand hygiene 100% of the time, we don't know whether some or all of those infections will be prevented. But some investigators have done very elegant research around this, and they're of the belief that about 40% of common healthcare-associated infections are due to cross-transmission, so transmission between a patient and an environment, or from a contaminated person to another person, whether it be a patient or back from a patient to a healthcare worker. So about 40% of healthcare-associated infections are thought to be due to that cross-transmission. There have been multiple studies, however, that show us if we improve hand hygiene and we get healthcare workers consistently doing the right thing in terms of hand hygiene, that the overall healthcare associated infection burden will be reduced. And there's really no argument about that amongst the microbiological communities, the clinical communities, the infection control community, and others. So we all know that, we all accept it, we don't dispute it, but still healthcare workers don't perform hand hygiene as often as is recommended. Now, some of the reasons that that occurs are probably more to do with human factors than any desire of a healthcare worker to blatantly disregard hand hygiene recommendations. So things like competing demands, the chaos of the healthcare system and the general healthcare delivery in Australia and in many other countries at the moment. If we don't have hand hygiene supplies very readily available, easily accessible, in prime working order, all of those things can subtly impact and cause a healthcare worker to be disinclined to perform hand hygiene. The other thing that can happen is that the healthcare worker may not recognise every time that they need to perform hand hygiene, and so education has been an important strategy that we've used. And much of the recent research that's now being performed is really looking closely and focusing on how we change healthcare workers' behaviours. And in fact, several eminent Australian researchers believe and have proven, in fact, that our hand hygiene behaviours and patterns are actually linked to how we were first taught to perform hand hygiene by our parents. We'll look at some infrastructure issues, and the main one here is where and how a hand hygiene agent is dispensed. So if we can have regular hand hygiene opportunities available, so if we can have hand hygiene, either sinks or hand wash basins or alcohol-based hand rub dispensers conveniently located, so it's easy for a healthcare worker to access them, then that will improve hand hygiene compliance. If we have adequate staffing, then staff will tend to perform hand hygiene more appropriately. One of the other factors is the impact on a healthcare worker's hands of the particular agent. And there are several different formulations that we can use in terms of hand hygiene product available to us in Australia. We can have a neutral detergent, plain soap-based solution which is used with water. We can have a range of waterless solutions, so alcohol-based hand rubs are the classic ones. So they're a liquid alcohol-based hand rub. Liquid-based, we can have alcohol-based hand gel, and that's available. And we also have alcohol-based hand foams. So we have liquids, gels, foams. Each one of those have different characteristics in terms of their effectiveness, their composition, and their residual effect, so how long they actually are active on a healthcare worker's hands. Now, imagine all of those different chemical solutions at different times being applied to a healthcare worker's hands, and it potentially sets up an interesting situation with the healthcare worker's skin, but also their microbial flora. That is, the bugs that live on a healthcare worker's hands. Other things that impact hand hygiene compliance include the priority that clinical staff apply to hand hygiene, and then their own perception of how important hand hygiene is to their own practice. So what's really important, I think, in modern healthcare is that healthcare workers understand what's available in their organisation, when they need to use it, and how they need to use it. So it's worthwhile us looking at a generic, again, World Health Organization piece of advice on how to use alcohol-based hand rubs. And we know that this alcohol-based hand rubs, so these are usually waterless. They can be any number of different solutions. So it could be a liquid, could be a gel, could be a foam. Generally, they are applied between 20 to 30 seconds, and they involve application, rubbing the hands palm to palm, rubbing the right palm over the left dorsum, interlacing the fingers, repeating that on the other side, putting the palm to palm and interlacing the fingers again, rubbing the backs of the fingers, rotationally rubbing around the thumbs and vice versa, and making sure that what's done on one hand is done on the other, so that all surfaces of the hands have been covered. And then the hands must be allowed to dry. Now all of this takes between 20 to 30 seconds, which doesn't seem like a long time when we say it, but as a healthcare worker under the gun delivering healthcare, 20 to 30 seconds can seem like an eternity. It's really, really important though that healthcare workers wait until that alcohol-based hand rub is dry before they have direct contact with the patient or with the patient's environment, and importantly, before they put on a pair of gloves. And that is a critical step. And so whenever we're investigating issues that healthcare workers think may be related to gloves, or if they have a skin irritation, then the very, very first thing that I would do with one of those healthcare workers is ask them to demonstrate to me, without prompting and without cues, how they routinely perform a alcohol-based hand rub, and I would watch that, and then I would also ask them how they perform an episode of hand washing. Now, hand washing is a little bit different in how it's recommended to be performed. So this one takes longer than using a hand rub. And this procedure is recommended to take between 40 to 60 seconds. It's used always when the hands are visibly soiled. So if there is any form of patient secretion or excretion or any soiling on the hands, then they must be washed. Any of the hand rubs are usually inefficient for removing that soil. So over 40 to 60 seconds, same general principles. An important point here at point 0 is wet the hands with water, and that's really critical. And some healthcare workers, when you observe them, do not routinely wet their hands before they apply the hand wash solution. They immediately put their dry hand under a dispenser and they apply soap. By not having wet hands, it stops the soap from moving across the entire surface of the hand, and instead you get a concentration of soap in one particular area. And over time, continuing to perform hand hygiene and hand washing with that method can potentially set up a very rapid opportunity for skin to become irritated on the hands. Again, the rubbing, the covering of all surfaces of the hands, and then note there again a couple of differences in terms of drying and rinsing. And I'll spend a few seconds talking about rinsing. At point 8 here on this slide, what we see is that the hands must be rinsed with water. And again, when I'm observing this, I ask a healthcare worker to perform a hand wash. When they've performed what they consider to be a reasonable rinsing, or they're up to point 8, and they indicate that they're about to stop and dry their hands, I do make them stop. And at that point, I ask them to vigorously rub their hands together. And most times, what I'll see is actually the formation of some bubbles. They may be small, but there will be bubbles. And that indicates to me that the rinsing hasn't been sufficient. So when healthcare workers are rinsing this hand wash off their hands, really, really important that the rinse goes over all of the surfaces of the hands so that there's no residual of that material on the hands. And after the rinsing, then drying using a good patting technique, single-use towel. Use the towel to turn off the faucet just to maintain a degree of asepsis, and then the hands are now safe. And the hands only go and touch an environment surface, or the hands only put on a pair of gloves when they're dry. So we can't overemphasize that. Now, other than when the hands are soiled, there's two other opportunities or two other times when alcohol-based hand rub is insufficient and hand washing has to be performed. And they are when a patient is infected with a non-enveloped virus and or when a patient has Clostridium difficile, which is a terrible gut bug that causes intense diarrhea. So under those circumstances, it is hand washing with soap and water rather than alcohol-based hand rub. And the only time in those circumstances when an alcohol-based hand rub can be used as the primary form of hand hygiene is when gloves have been worn. However, please remember that in healthcare generally, in healthcare everywhere, that gloves are not an alternative to hand hygiene. Gloves are an adjunct. And it's my belief that before donning a pair of gloves, hand hygiene should always be performed. Hands should be dried, gloves worn, for the duration of the procedure, gloves then removed, and hand hygiene performed again. So gloves, let me repeat, are not an alternative to hand hygiene. They are an adjunct. So they add to our whole sense of best practice infection prevention. Okay, let's look now at some best practice recommendations in regard to glove use in general settings and in procedure-specific times. So we'll spend a similar amount of time looking at gloves. So gloves are great. They've been around for many, many years. And what's so good about gloves is that they actually reduce our potential for our healthcare worker hands to come in contact with any blood or body fluid. So they perform as a barrier, and we know that's great. They've also been demonstrated to really reduce the risk of environmental and patient-to-patient transmission of pathogens. So if you think back to one of those early second and third slide, I think they were, and you think about if gloves had been worn, would there have been the transmission of those organisms between the patient, the little red organisms between the patient and his environment, and then subsequently between the healthcare worker and the environment? The answer is probably no. Now, gloves can have a range of protective characteristics, and those characteristics and the degree of protection actually change between different gloves, different manufacturers, and they all vary depending on their composition, so what they're made of, how thick they are, how elastic they are, how strong they are, how durable they are, and importantly, how comfortable they are and what state they are provided. So gloves can be sterile, they can be unsterile. They can have a very thick composition, and I know that for one of the recommendations that we have is that household gloves are worn for domestic work or domestic activity, for cleaning in hospitals, and environmental services staff will often wear heavy gloves similar to domestic setting. Whereas when we have other opportunities in the hospital, we'll recommend only an exam glove, which may not even need to be sterile. Or if we have surgeons performing long cases, we might go all the way and say we want you to wear an antimicrobial impregnated glove. And by the way, we'll also make sure that it has some softening and moisturizing materials and properties so that your hands are treated kindly and comfortably. And by that we can continue to keep your skin intact, because keeping the skin intact is really important. The skin's our largest organ, and it provides a very fine barrier, a great barrier to organisms invading our body. It's our #1 defense mechanism. And what we want to make sure is that the skin on your hands always remains intact and in great condition. So deciding which glove to be worn depends on a lot of things, but the healthcare worker actually has to make an assessment before they decide, and they have to think about a few things. So first of all, you have to think about how likely is it that you will be exposed to anything that is contaminated or any blood or body fluids. So if you're performing a procedure, are you likely to come in contact with blood or any other body secretion? Or are you just likely to have contact with equipment that's contaminated? Is it some form of toxic chemical that you might be touching? Or is the site contaminated? So then you'll make an assessment whether or not to wear gloves. And that assessment helps you work out the strength of the material and perhaps the composition. You'll also think about how long you're going to wear it. And you might then also be guided about whether or not you need a sterile glove or a non-sterile glove. Now, if you're performing an aseptic procedure, which is defining all of that and describing examples is beyond the scope of today's presentation, but if a healthcare worker, you, are going to have any contact with a sterile site, then it's critical that sterile gloves are used. And we can't emphasize that enough. So sterility is important in the whole procedure, and asepsis requires contact with a sterile site, then you must use sterile gloves and make them available and don them in a way that maintains their sterility. I think this is a particularly useful pyramid for decision making that was developed by the World Health Organization. So It goes through what WHO recommends for sterile glove indications, so vascular access procedures, central lines, TPN, chemotherapeutic agents, and then when you can use clean gloves, direct patient exposures, indirect patient exposures, so providing a barrier there really for you and stopping you from becoming soiled or having inadvertent contact with any body fluids, and then gloves not indicated. So unless a patient is under contact precautions, which are a completely separate, different system of isolation, and we may talk about them in a subsequent epic, gloves are usually not indicated for, general things like taking blood pressure, doing a temperature, giving a medication, transporting a patient, or any indirect patient care, so using the telephone. Now, this is important because what I'd like to make sure is that once a healthcare worker has finished the sterile procedure or finished the clean glove procedure that's required them to wear sterile gloves or clean gloves, once the healthcare worker has removed themselves from a situation where they may have contact with a contaminated environment, and the gloves should come off at that point and hand hygiene should be performed. And I'm horrified in modern Australian healthcare to see healthcare workers who wear gloves rather than perform hand hygiene. So they may finish a procedure and then they may go and jump on the phone or answer a page or answer their cell phone or whatever's ringing or pick up their iPad and away they go. And that's just dumb. It makes no sense, and it certainly can increase transmission or contamination and subsequently can increase transmission. So if we don't wear gloves properly, there's a few things that can happen. One, not wearing them properly can give us a false sense of protection. And in fact, we may be contributing to the healthcare associated infection burden rather than preventing it. The other thing that can happen is if we don't perform adequate hand hygiene and particularly don't dry our hands or we don't wet our hands before we apply these strong chemical solutions that are in hand hygiene products, we can really be jeopardizing or putting at risk the integrity of our skin on our hands. So protecting skin integrity is important, and I'll now focus on that issue. There are probably about 10 ways in which we can protect skin integrity. And let's start by understanding what healthy skin is. Every day on our healthy skin from our hands, we shed about 10 to the power of 7 particles of skin. And of all of those, I think it's more than 1 million. In fact, it's 10 million. What we have is 10% of those have actual viable bacteria in them. So they're normal, hopefully normal flora that live on our skin. Our skin generally has an acidic pH, so that acidic pH lets our skin have an antibacterial effect, so it can potentially protect us from bugs that may be potentially pathogenic. And our skin also has lots of lipids in it that are contained, and they prevent dehydration. So lipids and fats in our skin are important. But then we go along every day and many, many times a day and we perform hand hygiene, and we need to do that. In fact, we need to do it even more than we are, about 20% more than we are, I'd suggest. What happens when we perform this hand hygiene? Well, we increase the pH of our skin, we reduce the lipids, and we increase the amount of water that's lost from the transepidermal surfaces of our skin, and we increase the shedding. So we're putting our hands and the skin of our hands under some degrees of pressure. We want to make sure in doing that, which we should be able to do, we should be able to do that and also maintain healthy hands. So what do healthy hands look like? Well, healthy hands aren't that hard to recognize. Healthy hands are when skin is intact, as it is in both surfaces of these hands. It's when there's no change in skin flora, so there's nothing obvious there. There's no signs of indication or signs of irritation, redness, no drying, no cracking, no itching, and no bleeding. And that's the sign of a healthy hand. We don't have any dryness, we don't have any burning, no scaling, and no fissures. That's healthy hands. And really important that we don't have any of those things, because each one of those can potentially be an opportunity for a pathogen to enter into our body and to take up residence and perhaps even cause us infection entering through our skin. So healthy hands have none of those things, no damage, no signs of it. But more importantly, or equally importantly, they are also able to withstand repeated episodes of appropriate hand hygiene with the appropriate agent using the appropriate technique, as we've described today. And they're really, really important points to remember. So you want to aim always to have healthy skin, and you want the people around you to have healthy hand skin. So healthy hands are important because we know that if a healthcare worker has skin on their hands that's irritated, then they are very disinclined to perform hand hygiene. And when healthcare workers become disinclined to perform hand hygiene, guess what? They don't perform it, and up goes the opportunity for spreading and transmitting more healthcare-associated infections. If we have healthy hands, we have reasonable microbiological flora on our hands, and that reduces the opportunity for some other organisms which are less friendly and less forgiving to take up residence on our hands. We don't want to become colonized with Staphylococcus. We don't want to become colonized with gram-negative bacilli, for example. It also reduces the opportunity for bacteria to shed, and that's also good because we don't want to be shedding bacteria, excessive bacteria. And in stopping that, by performing hand hygiene, by stopping the opportunity for our hands to become colonized and reducing shedding to a normal amount, then we protect the patient from transmission of any organisms through our hands. It also protects us, if our hands are healthy, from any accidental exposure to infectious agents. So that's why healthy hands are important, and I hope you'll have a healthy respect for healthy hands now. But there are some very common triggers that can cause damage amongst healthcare workers, and here they are. Improper technique, we've talked a lot about that. It can be irritating, we can cause abrasion. If you don't use the right amount of agent, and people sometimes never cease to amaze me in that they will often think if they use double the hand hygiene, recommended hand hygiene application, that they'll get twice as much effective hand hygiene. It doesn't actually work like that. If you use the appropriate amount, you'll have appropriate hand hygiene experience. The temperature of the rinse water is important, and it should be something that you can tolerate, not too hot. If we don't rinse completely or dry completely our hands, our wrists or our forearms, then we can have problems. If we use unnecessary agents, so don't overuse the hand hygiene product. Understand when it's appropriate to use alcohol-based agents, alcohol-based hand rubs, and when it's important or appropriate to use routinely soap and water. You don't need to use both of them necessarily. You may, however, experience irritation just from some of the hand hygiene agents, and you might, in fact, get irritation for products that are used to dry the hands. And all of those things, those points listed above, can all lead to irritant contact dermatitis. There's some other things that can lead to it. They include your type of skin, and there are different classifications for them. If you don't dry your hands properly, if you don't moisturize them every day, at least once a day, if you use products that are incompatible, and not all moisturizers are compatible with the solutions that are used for alcohol-based hand rub in hospitals. And so that's why it's always good to use moisturizers that are recommended by work when you're at work. We know there's a difference in climates and how they affect skin, their hands on the skin. And it seems to be that when locations experience extreme climatic change, that's when there are issues more likely to occur. If you frequently and repeatedly use hand hygiene product, that can be a trigger in and of itself. If you have a history of dermatitis, or you've got a risk of dermatitis or other dermatitis-related responses. If you are abraded, and glove powder has been demonstrated to be a common trigger of damage. And so the powder-free range of gloves becomes important. So you can reduce these opportunities. Here are some of the things that you can do to reduce that risk. One, choose less irritating products. So choose less irritating hand hygiene formulations and use less irritating products in terms of gloves. So they may be gloves with extra skin protective features. So they may include, some different compositions. eliminate any of those unnecessary practices that increase skin irritation. So get your technique right, get the activity right, and you'll be right. Regularly use skin moisturizers, at least twice a day, if not 3 times. So around a meal break is a good time as well as before and after your shift. But when all of that fails, or if there are still issues, we're lucky because manufacturers are now giving us the opportunity to have many more compositions of gloves. And as I've alluded to, there are now gloves that have unique inner coatings, that have special formulations of protective formulations, and those gloves not only have these special coatings, but they also have excluded accelerants, which are chemicals that can be particularly irritating. And these new gloves are now available, and for some clinicians they will be a good solution to the problem with skin irritation. So these new glove compositions also reduce reaction. They are very comfortable, in fact superiorly comfortable. They're soft and they can fit quite naturally to people's hands. They also can include some moisturizing agents, and those moisturizing agents or moisturizing characteristics promote water retention, and they also provide other barrier formulations which will help the skin to maintain its natural integrity and its ability to be naturally protective. So some of these can be anti-allergenic, they can be comfortable. There's also antimicrobial gloves. And these antimicrobial gloves include inner coatings with chlorhexidine gluconate, and that provides wearers with antimicrobial protection. And recently there are gloves with advanced allergy protection, and they're available free of chemical accelerators in non-latex, and they provide a really safe alternative for healthcare workers who know that they have suffered with a sensitivity to either latex and or type 4 sensitivity. So the current thinking, as these products are evolving, is that increased contact with allergies reflect the role, increased incidence of contact allergies rather reflects the role of the chemical accelerants as the irritating factor rather than natural latex. So in the past we've thought, oh, it's latex, you know, I'm allergic to latex. It's probably more likely to have been a response to a chemical accelerant. So important to keep that in mind as well. So what would be a model of best practice? Well, I think education in proper technique is really important. Always assessing a healthcare worker's technique, providing them with suitable agents, suitable alternatives that don't compromise their safety or the patient's, providing moisturizers, and then promoting and responding to hand-skin self-assessment. So teaching healthcare workers how to perform an assessment of their own skin and then being responsive to it in a timely way and in an empathetic way. And always, 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 it's the job of the infection prevention team, and along with, particularly in the operating room and in other places, for healthcare workers to have their concerns regarding hand hygiene listened to and responded to. And that's important. And I think even for some of the smaller primary care settings that we've spoken about, so general practices, podiatry, dentistry, some of those areas, there may not be the opportunity for exposure to infection prevention experts. There may not be the opportunity to discuss these issues with an occupational health and safety department because they simply don't exist in those smaller organisations. But nonetheless, you know, it's good to have the healthcare workers provided with an opportunity to discuss these concerns with people who are knowledgeable and understand the real risks, and that's important rather than the healthcare worker making their own assumptions. So when you are involved in the selection of a hand hygiene agent, there are many things to consider. The clinical requirements are important, of course, how efficacious that antiseptic agent is, whether it be a triclosan, a chlorhexidine, or some other formulation. The product has to be acceptable to healthcare workers. So if they find it too drying or too irritating, they won't use it, and then you'll find out that you have lots of other problems. So once you've selected a product, it has to be made accessible, and the dispensing systems can be important. How many you have, where they're placed, how well they're maintained, and what type they are. Are they intuitive? You know, are they easy to operate? Do they require any additional education? So they're important factors in hand hygiene agent consideration. So let's now quickly look at the steps that we would undertake when investigating skin irritation. Here they are. Well, first of all, we'll get ready by looking at this horrid image of, someone with really irritated skin. Here are the 10 things that I think are important. First of all, have to try and narrow down and see what this issue may actually be related to. Is it related to the alcohol-based hand rub, soap, antisepsis, or is it related to glove use? So we narrow that down and we truly can try and understand it. We also ask the healthcare worker, do they routinely use a moisturiser, at least 3 times a day? And then we observe their practice, and I talked to you about that earlier. We make sure that if they're not using an alcohol-based solution, so if they're using just a soap with water, that we want to make sure they wet their hands, because that increases the surface tension of their hands and allows the solution to be spread evenly across their hand. We ask them to do that rinsing test that I described to you before, and that shows us whether or not they're rinsing efficiently. If their technique and their rinsing technique is sufficient, then let's have a look at how well they're drying. Are they using too much force? Are they using the wrong movements? Or is the paper too irritating? There's some things to look at. Then we can ask the healthcare worker about some other irritants. So sometimes you may find on questioning that they've introduced a new laundry detergent at home, or they've got a new cleaning product that they're using, or they've got a new lotion or a new skin perfume or something along those lines. So, or they may be giving themselves some over-the-counter treatments. So really do that deep dive questioning, and that will help you understand a whole lot more. Then you might want to ask, are there healthcare workers who are experiencing similar symptoms which are unusual or unexpected? And that can let you understand, the extent of the problem. And then try and establish whether or not there might be a relationship between weather and humidity especially. If the healthcare worker has changed or recently increased how frequently or how long they perform alcohol-based hand rub, hand hygiene, or how long they wear gloves for, or if they've changed the brands or the products that they're using, then that can be an important clue as well. So there are 10 critical steps, I think, in investigating any irritation, and always, if you are unable to get to a definitive answer, or if you can't resolve the problem, then of course the healthcare worker needs to be referred to for expert opinion, in the first instance probably to their family doctor, who would then perhaps make a decision to refer them on. But investigating skin irritation is really, really important. So that's basically all I had to say today, other than to emphasize to you how important good hand hygiene is, how important care of the skin and the hands is, and that together we can have healthy skin. It can exist and coexist, hand hygiene and good glove use together, and in fact we need them to coexist, because only by doing that can we reduce some of the very many healthcare associated infections that occur all around the world and affect between 10 up to about 10% of all patients, but importantly those infections which claim lives both here in Australia and internationally.